Okay, tonight we're going to start out with mobile and embedded device security. These things can be a pain, and mobile devices, the bring your own device, is something that most networkers really hate because you don't have control of the device. There are ways kind of around it, and we'll look at some of those as we go through. So the objectives are to identify different types of static environments and methods of mitigating risks in static and embedded systems. And they imply, at least in the instructor's manual, that static environment is a CompTIA term. Describe mobile security concepts and technologies, implement BYOD, bring your own device policies, and mobile device management, MDM. And MDM is going to manage the BYODs and make it a little bit more secure for us. Identify uses and risks in short-range radio communications, Bluetooth and NFC near-field communication, which is what all these pay with your phone apps use if your phone supports NFC. Doesn't go very far, but there's always going to be a risk. Anytime that you put something in the air, there's going to be some sort of risk to it. So static environments are ones that the user makes little or no change to them. They remain fairly constant over a period of time. A PC is a dynamic where we can install hardware, software, and continuously do updates on them. So they become dynamic. The static we don't have to do a lot of frequent changes, which makes it a little easier for security because you don't have to worry about the changes and the things that may have been introduced that are now vulnerabilities. Ideal for security, but the static devices may be a black box of security, and then later on they say, well, maybe a black box of security mainframes, but also a black box to hackers, maybe a black box to hackers. So the static environment examples, the embedded systems and operating systems for smartphones, tablets, and game consoles. And you say, well, we install apps, and up here they say software, and that is true. We usually don't install hardware on the phones and the tablets. And when we do the update, we don't update the file system per se. It's usually going to be a firmware update because we don't use disks and those things. Static environments may or may not be well documented and or well understood. So the embedded systems is the complete computer system has a dedicated function. The phones, yeah, we have the phones. They're really little mini computers, handheld computers that we carry around. Tablets are the same way. They do a lot of different things, but they still remain fairly static. They have vulnerabilities as you put apps on. Android going to have more vulnerabilities than Apple because there's more places, more ways to get the apps. Everything from Apple comes from Apple. They keep it pretty much a closed system. So embedded systems can be as small as an IV drip meter, or could be a system large enough to manage a water treatment plant or anything else. Industrial control systems. Industrial control systems are usually going to use firmware running on a PLC, programmable logic controller. SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems, a mouthful, and then a / HVAC control, are large-scale multi-site systems that monitor and manage industrial infrastructure. And I think that's probably what was compromised with the Iranian centrifuges. And so they may be built without security in mind. Many of them are legacy systems, so they're gonna have security going to have vulnerabilities in most cases. Printers, scanners, and fax machines have hard drives, so you need to securely delete the images. And the hard drives occasionally fail. They have their own operating system. They're going to have vulnerabilities just like computers do, because the new ones really are little mini computers. One of the biggest threats for us in the I think in the printer world is that we leave a document that shouldn't be on the copy machine after we get done making our copies. The other thing it's got to be done is the hard drives have to be cleaned before you dispose of, or if the hard drive gets changed. Sometimes they fail and they come in and change the hard drive, and what they're typically going to do is just take the old one out, put a new one in, and go away. You don't really want that. You want to clean the hard drive before it happens. If you're getting a new one, you may want to keep that hard drive and dispose of it properly. And then we have our in-vehicle computing systems. There are a number of those that they control a lot, probably just about everything anymore. The brakes, acceleration, transmission, shift points, combustion, GPS, and a lot of them have data recorders so that if you have an accident, they can go back and look at your black box and see how fast you really were going, how if you applied your brakes, and those sorts of things. And then we have these are now hackable systems. Automobiles are hackable systems. Anytime you connect something to the internet, it's going to be hackable. So we get that. They had the Jeep that they did.
Hey, Larry.
Yes.
Clyde's here. His mic's acting up.
Say what?
Clyde is here.
Okay.
He just got here.
Okay.
I am here also.
Who was I am? Who was I am here also?
Dean.
That's Dean.
Okay, Dean. Yeah, I got Dean. I didn't see Clyde log in. Got him though. Okay. Anyhow. Vehicle hacking may be the next big thing. Actually, a lot of articles I read said that medical devices are going to be the next object of hacking, and they've had some of the mystery shows on television do some of that now. But they hacked the Jeep, and they made it, in a lot of the reporting, sound like, oh, they just stepped up and hacked this thing. They took them about a year to get it done, and they had some pretty extensive background information to do that. Hackers don't live in the microwave society like a lot of us do, where we want instantaneous results. We all want instantaneous results, but they're not necessarily going to get them, and they'll wait. They do the observation, all the steps that are involved to get there. So they're very patient people. Static operating system environments, multiple use computing environment, but multiple use because we multiple apps, but it's closely tied to the hardware device, and even in the desktop world, Apple still does that. iOS has a tie to Unix, and the Mac OS has a tie to Linux. It's actually a form of OpenBSD. Just because a system is open source doesn't mean you can't sell it. It just means you have to share the source code. Android, mostly associated with Google, is actually done by the Open Handset Alliance. It's a little bit more relaxed application model. If you're going to get apps from them, it's not a single store like the iOS is, where you get it from Apple, and Apple can control everything that goes on the device. You have to find a trusted store, and then you can download it from there. The apps are supposed to all run in a sandbox, and the sandbox means that they're isolated from everything else. Java, for instance, on the desktop is supposed to run in a sandbox. A number of apps are. They don't get access to the rest of the system. The Android updates are generally going to be at the discretion of the handset vendor. So they may not come out as quickly as the Apple ones do. Malware, what they talk about, staged payloads. First, they send you something that's clean, and you can get antivirus softwares to check the Android specifically. I've never looked for one for the iOS device. And from there, it checks when you get a download. But the staged is first you get the basic one, and then they add stuff on. And the add-ons may wind up having some sort of malware in them. So they do try to infect these. Or somebody tries to infect everything, sometimes to get something, sometimes just for the fun of it. We also have smart TVs. The Linux kernel, generally what they really are is a Linux system with a big screen on it. They're susceptible to browser exploits. One of the things that somebody would love to do is turn one of these things on, the cameras and the microphones, maybe in a conference room. So they have to be checked too. If they're in your environment, they have to be controlled. In mainframes, we've come full circle with a lot of this stuff. We went from centralized computing with the mainframe and virtual machines to distributed computing with the desktop, and now with virtualization, we're kind of coming back to a mainframe virtual machine sort of approach. They have built-in redundancy. The mainframe's built-in redundancy because they can run for years without being taken down, and in many cases they do. I mean, you reboot a server, you reboot your desktop, but I don't know, anybody that works around a mainframe knows when the last time a mainframe was rebooted, because they don't want to do that. They use proprietary software, and then it says it is a black box to much of IT, and it is a black box to much of many of the hacking community also. Attacks on mainframes are generally going to be specialized, targeted. Game consoles, tuned to the hardware, and they're streamlined. They've got large hard drives. They're either going to be a Linux or a Windows system, so they also have exploits. And game consoles are becoming a bigger and bigger part, I guess, of the entertainment that we have. They do more and more and more and more streaming and connecting to the internet, online gaming, those sorts of things. And when you start doing any of that kind of action, you're going to have some risks involved. Mitigating risks in the static environment. Any single control can be compromised, and some of the traditional controls that we use may not be appropriate in these things. What we want to use, and not just in a static environment, in the dynamic environment too, is security layers. And that can be a lot of different controls, or it can be things like if we have firewalls, we have this dual firewall that we talked about with the DMZ. If you have a Cisco at one and some other manufacturer, the second one, if they compromise the Cisco, then they have to use a whole set of different tools to overcome the second one. So what we want them to have to do is to be able to overcome multiple technologies, and each of those protections can't depend on the other. They have to be independent sort of things. They give an example of a bank and what they would do. Don't depend on a single layer, but include controls such as guards, policies, procedures, cameras, vaults, alarms, and a variety of locks and other access controls. So all of those, the the guard doesn't depend on the lock and the lock doesn't depend on the guard, so they need to be independent. Network segmentation, and we've talked about that. We want to segment the network for both efficiency, because if we segment, we're going to have less broadcast traffic, as well as security. When we have the security components of it, by separating it or segmenting it, it makes it a little more difficult to find the whatever that they're trying to find. We don't want to just secure the perimeter, but you want to secure the rest of it. Sniffing, we've talked about that. You really need to be on that network to do sniffing. You can actually look for some of those things with the Nmap. Application firewalls are going to look inside the packet to see what's there. They can help you keep applications off of the network that you don't want, and those may be a number of things. You may not want to different chat programs. You may or may not want to, because one of the things that may happen to you if users threaten somebody from inside your network to outside your network, the company may wind up with some liabilities. So they're going to protect software, specific applications and devices, and maybe SCADA would do that. The SCADA, the environmental controls portion of these things, have been involved in a number of recent compromises, because they now control, and the building, the place that I just left, the building was controlled. There's a company controlled it. They connected via the internet to control the temperature in the building, turn the air conditioning on, turn the air conditioning off, turn the furnace on, set the temperatures in the different rooms. Once they're on the network, unless you have it isolated and they give up their credentials, then the hacker has his foothold in the network and can go on with the progression there to get access to the rest of the network, escalate privileges, and all those sorts of things that they can do. Wrappers are also available, and we talk about IPsec, where we encrypt the entire packet and put a new header, a wrapper on it to send it from location to location. So we can use those things. One other, and I think the last one in the list, is firmware version control and manual updates. Many of the embedded systems actually use low-cost chips, and the vendor doesn't produce updates. And I think that a lot of our motherboards are that way. Occasionally you get a firmware update, but not like you get a Windows update or a Linux update, or even a Mac update. And we're talking about the Android. I've had an Android phone. I didn't get into the smartphone world until last year, actually. So I've had this Android phone for a little over a year, and it's had exactly one update. The Apple devices that we've had have had, like, I think 4 updates over that course of time. A lot of embedded systems are going to require manual updates, and each of these do. The Android said, do you want to do it? Yeah, I'm ready to do it. And when you get the ones from Apple, they don't install automatically. They'll download and say, let me know when you're ready to update it. So we have to do those things. We have to do the manual updates of the systems. The mobile device security issues, they're easy to lose, they're easy to steal, and they're easy to sneak into someplace. The concerns portability and capacity, because you can sneak one of these devices in, or even a flash drive or phone, tablet, and store an awful lot of company corporate material on it relatively quickly and then walk out with it. The devices usually are single user, although Android supports multi-user on its tablets. Other things that we could use, well, locational data, set up the systems, particularly ones that the company owns, so that they are locatable. And I know that you got to be on a network. You've got to have some sort of communication to be able to find the devices. Screen locks, lockouts, and remote wiping are all things that should be configured on the devices, because there's going to be some data on the devices which may or may not be encrypted. If it is encrypted, the key is going to be stored on the device. If you use encryption on the apps, the key is going to be stored with the app. If somebody roots the device, then they're going to be able to get the key and decrypt all of the information. Cached passwords are probably going to be there, and the cached passwords in all likelihood are going to be reused someplace else. You can also do the lockout policy, and again, we'll get back to the Apple phone, the one that in San Bernardino had a lockout policy, and it was 10 bad attempts at the 4-digit PIN, and then it would destroy all of the information on the phone. So we can have those things. In the corporate, in our private ones, what we're concerned about usually is what's on it. The corporate, we're concerned about protecting the data. We'd just as soon the data went away from the device than have it compromised. So, and hopefully it's going to be backed up, stored someplace else. We can do full device encryption. The data, again, the data is encrypted, the key stored on the device. iOS and Android both derive the key from the PIN, or if you configure it for a password, from the password. So to make a strong key, you're going to need to have a strong password. Each of them has the ability to encrypt the devices. The removable storage are always going to be a problem with these things. The mobile device got flash memory. We may be able to add micro SD chips or micro SD storage to it, particularly to Android. I don't think you can with the Macs. But lots of removable storage, lots of ability to take a lot of information on them, or put a lot of information on them. Triangulation and GPS tracking to find these things. Triangulation is handy for emergency calls, but in some, and they say in some countries, I don't know that happens here, but that sometimes that information is sold so that you can be tracked. They have GPS, global positioning systems, so that you can find the device if you lose it. It also enables you, and the location services goes with the GPS, enables you to say, hey, you know, how do I get home from here, or how do I get to some particular restaurant? Unless the system knows where you are, it doesn't know how to help you or how to find the nearest Walmart or the nearest police station. When we go inside, the GPS systems really don't work very well. I find that if I turn mine on in the garage, it can't find a satellite. Sometimes they lose them under trees. Usually something's cached that you can do that. But there are indoor positioning systems, IPSs, that also work. And then we have the location services that are available. The primary concern with all of these location type services is privacy and being able to keep your location private. If somebody's trying to find you that you don't want to find you, these kinds of things can expose you. I mean, there are a number of reasons, I guess, that you would want to do that. The MDM, the mobile device management, is a management software that applies policies to mobile devices. Its objective is to manage those devices that the enterprise owns, and BYOD devices, bring your own device, that users allow to be managed. People want to bring their devices and use them in the workplace, and there's a lot of pressure to do that. So in order to help with security, we have the MDM systems, mobile device management systems, that can apply some policies to them. It's similar to NAC, where NAC, remember, checked to be sure certain elements were in place before it allowed the system on the network. So it is a system similar to NAC, check certain things, and then we enroll the devices and apply different policies to them. We may or may not allow certain apps to run, the cameras to be used, the mics to be used, those sorts of things. The mobile device management systems have to support multiple OSs, and you're probably not going to be able to support them all, so you may get one that supports certain ones, and you let the workforce know which ones are supported. Asset tracking and control software, when we use asset tracking and inventory control software, it has to be locked so that the user can't change it. And then application control, we're going to whitelist apps. Whitelist, as you remember, is we only allow those things to run which are on the whitelist. Blacklist specifies the things that can't run. The MDM puts the mobile device into a corporate workspace and even has corporate storage installed on the system while it's on the corporate network. Unused features should always be disabled, just like anything else. Anything that's not being used we should disable, because the only thing that we're doing is presenting a larger attack surface. BYOD concerns. If it were up to most IT managers, I think that they would just say no. But lots of pressure to do that, keeping the workforce happy. We allow that in a lot of cases. And when we talk about BYOD, we're not talking about bringing your tablet to work and being able to get an internet connection, because we can keep that separate from the production network. What we're talking about here is allowing these devices on the production network where the business of the company is being done, where if things get infected, we could actually do some damage. So, and what we have to have is user acceptance and adherence to the corporate policies, and we have to have policies on how to manage these devices. What are we going to allow? How much are we going to allow? I think any place that I've ever worked lately that allowed those things, even in the building, just allowed an internet connection, didn't really allow it to be used on the network. Well, I'll take that back, because we had for us unwashed, we had an internet connection, but for the networkers and people that might need it, in the wireless had a second SSID, which actually was allowed access to the network. So it depends on what you want to do and how you want to set up. And then the architecture and infrastructure considerations. Which of the devices, kind of mentioned this before, which of the devices qualify, and what you may have to do is set up a choose list, because you're probably not going to be able to support all of them. Successful BYOD corporate IT has to have at least some control over the private devices, and that's where we get into issues. If it's a company device, it's not an issue, and it might be easier to issue corporate phones and corporate tablets to the individuals to use on the network. Then you can control them and then let them take them home if they want to. you can control them. If they are privately owned, they have to agree to let you do those things. And one of the things that we're going to want to do is if it's lost or stolen or those sorts of things, we want the first call to be to corporate so that it can be wiped instead of to the phone company to find out what you can do with them. So we have to have acceptable use policies, those sorts of things. Onboarding and offboarding means bringing them into the system and putting them out of and letting them out of the system. Onboard camera and video, again, that's one that you're going to have to define what you're really going to allow to happen in these things. Privacy and how we store these things. The onboard camera and video geofencing would allow the camera and the video and probably the microphone to be disabled in specific locations so that if you get into one of those areas, they do get disabled. I think the key here is that the users have to agree to the policies and have to allow you to do some management of their device, which they may not want you to be able to do. The software, the MDM software, helps with applying the policies so that we can make it secure. Remember, all of these the objective of all of this all the time is to make our network secure. BYOD concerns, patch and antivirus management. Who does it? Does it get completed on a regular basis? And usually IT is going to want to take over these functions, and the users then have to give IT the ability to do that. We have to have a policy on data ownership. So I'm jumping around. Users might ignore the patches or install one that breaks the corporate system. It doesn't have to be tested. It's just like we talked about doing Microsoft updates. If you have just general software, Office, and the Microsoft stuff is probably not going to be an issue. If you have proprietary software, an update might break it. You need to try it out, and that's what IT is going to do here, is try out the updates to see if it's going to break anything that is relevant to the network. Data ownership, privacy, and storage segmentation. We have to have a policy on how that's going to be done. Storage segmentation, the MDM can actually make an area where the corporate information is stored. And then we have the onboard camera and video again, and those are always going to be an issue. We know that, and the ability to record. Are you going to allow them into meetings, board meetings, things like that? There have been a number of high-profile snuck in the phone and then recorded meetings that people really didn't want to be public. So you have to be aware of what you can and can't do and what they can and can't do with these devices inside the network, inside the workplace actually. To have an acceptable use policy, how can you use the device, how can they use the network when we allow them into the system. Forensic and legal concerns, the legal concerns being that if you have the device on our network and you threaten somebody, the company can be held liable for it. So the legal issues have to be dealt with. It can be difficult to perform digital forensics on a private device. Sometimes you may not know that something's wrong, and they may be bypassing the inbound and outbound filter. So those things all become issues with BYOD. And going back to the first bullet is most IT would just say no, but the demand, insistence, request whatever of the workforce is such that it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of networks, and it has to become a bigger and bigger part of network security. It's still a real issue on how you do that. Who owns it? If I bring my phone and put it on your network, how much control can you have on it over it? That's why we have to have the policies, and the users have to agree to those policies before they connect their device. Application security, encryption and key management. The key, again, is stored on the device. We can encrypt the data. You can encrypt the apps, and if you encrypt the app, the key is going to be stored with the app. So any of these things that we do, it's kind of like encrypting file system. We store the key in the document itself. We're going to do similar things here. This key is going to be stored on the device. Again, if you can root the device, if the device gets rooted, it can be a problem because they can recover those keys in that circumstance. Credential management, again, most of them are going to be private, so or single user. I'll get to where I want to say here in a second. The passwords can't be securely included with the app code. Passwords can become an issue, and they're going to obviously be stored on the device itself. When we communicate off of the device, we still need to have a HTTPS connection, and keep in mind that these devices, the small devices, the browsers are really not full browsers. They are almost there. They don't support everything. They're generally going to support all the security that you need to do. Authentication and transitive trust, how we're going to authenticate people in, and many of them use the federated trust. If you remember, the federated trust is when one company trusts the other company. So you may want to do that. Geotagging, and geotagging I think can be an issue when you add the location to the metadata. So if you start uploading a bunch of pictures that says that you're someplace not at your house, and people see that on social media, they can track your movements, and if somebody wants to maybe burglarize your house, they say, oh yeah, we know they're not there now because this is where they are because of the geotagging. You've got to have the ability to disable the geotagging. And the locational data, other thing, when you install an app, it asks for permission to control certain elements. Well, you need to look at that and see what it's going to have access to, not control, but have access to. What does it want access to, and is it an overreach? The same thing with tagging or locational data. They keep coming up, the browsers keep coming up, we'd like to use your location. Can we use your location? You can turn that off, and in some cases you want to, but then if you need it to tell you how to get somewhere, you've got to turn it back on. So I think it's kind of a two-edged sword. It's good in some instances and not so good in others. Most of the apps say that it only uses it while the app is in use. Now, we're just going to have to trust them on that, I guess. Bluetooth and near-field communication. Bluetooth connectivity is a handy thing we use. Headsets, a number of different devices are going to connect via Bluetooth. Bluetooth is relatively short range. You can turn it on or off on your small device if you have, if you're using a headset, or if you're using one of these activity trackers, they use Bluetooth to synchronize to whatever device. Then the Bluetooth is going to be enabled. If Bluetooth's enabled, then the device becomes visible to any other one that is trying to, any other device that's looking for something to pair with. And they are paired a one-to-one. You have to put in a pair code. A lot of times the pairing code, this one's got a really nice one, is shown on Hamlet. Hammett would like to pair here. This is a really nice pairing code. The default is 0000, and that's what most of them are going to be using. So we have that, I guess, weakness in the Bluetooth. Bluetooth connectivity going to be visible if we turn it on. Authentication and authorization on them, if you still have the defaults or the devices have the defaults, it's going to be the 0000. There's no malware yet, but there is proof of concept that malware can be distributed via Bluetooth. Two different kinds of attacks, bluejacking and blue snarfing. Bluejacking is one that you kind of get spam or messages, a business card, a V card, or something like that through them. No known instances of malware yet with bluejacking. Blue snarfing is a little bit different. Blue snarfing that is stealing information from somebody's phone. They say that the exploit is now patched. It allows attackers to circumvent the authentication mechanism. Even without an exploit, a short PIN is extremely vulnerable to brute force attacks, and it is extremely vulnerable to brute force attacks. Near field communication, the uses, wave your pass in front of the gas station, stick your phone up to the payment console at a store using Apple Pay or I guess Google Pay, as long as the telephones themselves have the near field communications capability. There really haven't been a whole lot of exploits at this time. It's a fairly new technology, so I guess we just haven't got there. It has a range of 4 centimeters, so it's not going to go very far. It's a very, very weak system, but if somebody can read the information off of the magnetic strip of your credit card, they're probably going to figure out a way to read the information from your transmission to the payment console. So with that, we're at the review, which will identify different types of static environments and methods of mitigating risks in static and embedded systems, describe mobile security concepts and technologies, implement BYOD policies and mobile device management MDM, identify uses and risks in short-range radio communications, Bluetooth and NFC. Not the National Football Conference. So let's do the questions and then we'll take a break. True or false, the short range of Bluetooth devices make them low risk from a security point of view?
False.
False.
False. Bluetooth devices are lower risk than some other technologies, but there are published exploits for data theft, hijacking, and denial of service attacks on Bluetooth. Bluetooth uses the same frequency as the wireless access points, 2.4 gig. At the very least, you should stay up to date with security issues and news articles and advise users about the potentially dangerous exploits. And they claim, what, 10 feet or 10 meters or something like that. I've walked around a building with a Bluetooth headset, and it certainly went further than that through walls and all sorts of stuff. It got really iffy at times, but it was there. What are SCADA devices and what are the security issues associated with them? First one is, what does SCADA stand for? That was early on, wasn't it? What did SCADA stand for?
Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition System.
And what do? It's right there too.
It monitors and manages industrial infrastructure.
Yep. And the issue with them is a lot of them are legacy systems, and legacy systems, and then they're vulnerable to attack. A lot of times the controls systems like that we don't pay a whole lot of attention to. We're worried about the server or this or that, and I keep going back to the HVAC systems because there have been so many attempts there. And when you look at that, it's like, golly, we're really letting this guy that we don't know a whole lot about onto our network. It's segmented, but can they or somebody figure a way across it, or will they somehow reveal their passwords? They did a study, and I don't know if it's real or not, but in London, England, they were doing a survey, and they found out that most of the people there would sell their password for a candy bar.
Hell yeah, because candy bars in London are expensive as shit.
Yeah, well, so is all that time in jail. Why do we segment networks?
To protect them.
Protect them.
Scalability.
Scalability. Efficiency. Not as much broadcast traffic, although really, unless you got some really big networks, I don't know that your broadcast traffic is going in today is going to do that much, although Microsoft is not as bad, but it's still broadcast happy. I'll read you their whole long answer. We segment network for two reasons. First, for efficiency, segmenting limits broadcast, decreases collisions, etc., thereby increasing availability. But secondly, for security reasons. We want to avoid the egg defense, wherein we secure our network's perimeter but allow full freedom of movement within the network. Properly segmenting our network makes accessing sensitive items, sensitive systems, or hosts within the network far more difficult and reduces the possibility of sniffing. It also increases the ease with which we can look at traffic, for example, segmenting by protocol. Aside from leaving sensitive documents on it, are there security concerns with respect to printers?
Sure it is.
There are? And what are they?
We gotta think printers and everything sometimes actually have virtual, fingerprints of documents they've scanned.
Oh yeah.
And if people get information from that virtual scanning, they can actually use it to find out vulnerabilities, passwords, sensitive information people are not supposed to see.
Oh yeah, all of those things. And then they have the hard drives that we need to be sure that we scrub before they go anywhere, or if they change it, that we actually keep it. Because if it's dead, what do they care? What are the two main security concerns when it comes to mobile devices? Okay, go back further. Mobile devices. What are two of the big concerns?
Portability. Easy to lose and steal.
Yep. And portability. And what?
Then the device access control.
Access control, the capacity, the amount of data that we can actually put on one of these things. What is a mobile device? What is mobile device management, MDM?
Is a class of management software designed to apply security policies to the use of mobile devices.
Yep, exactly. It's like NAC. What is the first and last concern in the timeline with respect to managing security on employee devices? What's the first thing on manage them that have to do? There we go. Got to get them in the system, and what's the last thing we got to do?
Onboard them.
Onboard them and offboard them. How we get them in the system, how we get them out of the system. What must be done with mobile devices and storage to best defend against the interception or extraction of sensitive data? It's the same with all sensitive data, isn't it?
Turn off NFC.
Turn off NFC, that might work, but I don't think they're worried about your credit card. I think they're more worried about their corporate secrets. I agree.
Disable USB ports and stuff like that.
Yeah. What about encryption? Encryption. When you see sensitive data, and how do you protect sensitive data? Encryption. How do you stop man-in-the-middle attacks? Encryption. I mean, if you have a bunch of choices and you don't know what the answer is, probably encryption. Why allow employees to use their own mobile devices at work?
Cost effectiveness.
Convenience. They say employee satisfaction. Convenience could be cost effectiveness because you don't have to buy the devices, but you're still going to have to protect the network.
And because you don't actually technically have to buy the devices, therefore it's up to the individual to maintain their own phone. If they lose it, it's on them.
It is, but if they have your data, you want them to tell you immediately so you can wipe it. And you're going to have to do all of those things to set up with the policies and have the wipe software configured so that if it does happen, you can get to it quickly and get rid of the secure data. That hopefully is secure data. The encrypted data, because we encrypted it up here, right? Why not thoroughly lock employees' own devices down as you would with corporate-owned devices?
Because you technically don't own them, so therefore you don't have a right to do it.
That's right, and they don't like it when you lock down their devices. Would you like it if somebody locked down your phone, for instance? The next topic is risk management, and it's management because we really can't eliminate risk. We can mitigate it, we can lessen it, remove some of the elements, but it's difficult, probably impossible, to ever make risk go away because there's a little risk in everything. The objectives are understand the use of business continuity planning, business impact analysis, and risk assessment. And continuity planning is a big deal because if you haven't done that and something happens, we're talking major, not a hard drive crashes, then you don't have a real good chance of getting the business back up and running. Identify risk mitigation options and metrics. Describe risks involved in integrating data and systems with third parties. Use configuration management and change management policies to reduce risk. So the first is business continuity concepts. We got to plan and test the system to reduce impact, not impasse. To reduce impact on the system. Provide systems that are high availability and fault tolerant. We always want those. Backup mechanisms and resources, and we've talked about a lot of these things already. Any of this stuff, all of this, planning and testing the system, high availability, fault tolerant systems, backup systems, depending on how you do it, or any backup system, doing all of it can be costly. So it depends on the process of risk management. We've got to prioritize what we're going to do. We have continuity of operations and continuity of government are the objectives that we want to fulfill with these things. Continuity of business, keeping the business running in the face of a disaster. So the business impact analysis elements, first thing we have to do is identify critical functions or processes of the business or organization. What is critical? And when we look at this thing, what's critical for doing the business, not critical that somebody may think that it is. What's the impact of each of these functions, each of these elements on making the business run? And I guess one of the things that you may do when you do this is find things that you may not necessarily need. And then after we identify the functions, we're going to identify the assets and resources on which the organization depends. What do we have to have? What is critical? If the whole thing went away, what will we have to bring up first? What will we want to repair first? Identify threats to the organization's functions and assets. What are the threats that you foresee, that you perceive? You're going to need some help in these things, obviously. When we do this, you may have groups get together, identify the threats, identify the assets, identify the critical functions of the organization. And you're probably going to want to flow chart each of these things. I know that's a nasty thought for a lot of people, but flow chart how we make the business work. And then assess the risk to each function or asset given the threat. So we identify the threats. First, we identify the critical functions. What assets are needed to support the critical functions? What are the threats? And then what's the risk to each of the critical functions given the threats that we have identified? Assessment types. Risk assesses the likelihood that something's going to happen. Damage, loss or damage, and the consequences. What are the costs? And the costs may not just be monetary. The costs may be reputation, those sorts of things. It may be intangible costs involved here. And a threat refers to the sources and motivations. We've talked about those, what motivates different types of threat agents to do things. So the motivations of the people and the things that could cause the loss or damage. And the vulnerability refers to a flaw or weakness in the system and how it could be exploited to overcome the security systems that we set up. What are the vulnerabilities, and then can we reduce our exposure to the vulnerabilities? Identification of critical systems. When we do this, people are always going to be at the top of the list because the people are what really make the company run. The safety of the people is always going to be, should always be the first concern. Tangible assets, buildings, furniture, equipment, machinery, plant, electronic data files, paper documents, all of those things are going to be tangible assets. Intangible assets, ideas, commercial reputation, brand, things like that are going to be those. The procedures, the supply chains, critical procedures, and standard operating procedures. Asset tagging is something that we're going to want to do in this, and RFID tags can be handy, not always inexpensive, but can be handy because they can report themselves after you have identified. We can also use barcodes, barcoding for the asset tagging. but they do need to be. And then we're going to classify the assets and their impact or loss, and they're going to be classified as critical or necessary. Critical, obviously, going to be the highest on the threat list, and necessary things that we would really want to have. The threat identification is we're going to compile a prioritized list of the threats that are specific to our organization. We can have specific threats and non-specific threats. The specific threats are the ones that the identification processes that we did here, all of the assets, tangible, intangible procedures, and then we did the tagging and we did classification and made a list of a prioritized list. We also have non-specific threats, natural disasters, theft, vandalism, conflict can be things, espionage, fire is a non-specific threat. We can mitigate all of these different non-specific threats by doing taking certain actions. Fire inspections take fire materials or flammable materials out of the building, out of the system. Theft, vandalism, we can do the things we talked about last night with the physical security to prevent those things. Conflict, I don't know, and I think this is armed conflict. We're not going to be a whole lot about it. Natural disaster, there are some procedures, I think, that you can take to help protect yourself against natural disasters. Flooding, for instance, move materials if you're in a flood-prone area. Move those critical things to a floor above the ground floor. How is the building constructed? If you're in an earthquake area, move into a building that is quote earthquake proof unquote, that has the controls that would make it less susceptible. There are external impacts, things that we don't own, don't control, can't do a whole lot about. Public infrastructure, if the power goes out or we lose water, those sorts of things, law and order, transportation. So public infrastructure can be an issue. They come in and say, hey, we're going to turn the water off in 2 hours so that we can fix a break someplace, for instance, and they don't tell you how long it's going to be off. You can't do anything about that, and you need water for your people. Supplier contracts, the supply chain, we may or may not be able to do anything about. Customer security, not the security like we've been talking about, but the security that they're going to stay in business. The customers and the suppliers security are both there. So if an important failure of an important customer, we don't have anything. Or if you're a business that only has 1 or 2 customers, you may want to try to become a little bit more diverse with your customer base. Epidemic or disease can certainly impact what's going on. Flu season can impact how the business does business and how much business can be done. And then they say be up to date with best practices, and that's best practices for whatever business that you're in. Risk calculations, and this calculating can be complex, it can be confusing. What we're trying to do is determine the likelihood and what the impact is going to be on the system. And we can have quantitative or qualitative assessments. The quantitative, the SLEs, and these are kind of the things that I think they love to ask about. Single loss expectancy. How much do you expect to lose in a single loss? And then the exposure factor. what is the exposure of the system. The annual loss expectancy is the number of times a year you expect the single loss expectancy to happen. And then we have the annual rate of occurrence determined, let's see, what do they say here? This is determined by multiplying the SLE by the annual rate of occurrence, the annual loss expectancy. Yeah, that makes sense. Simple thing, how many times, what's going to be the loss? The annual loss expectancy, how many times is it going to happen, times the single loss expectancy is going to get the annual cost. The qualitative assessments is probably going to be more of a group approach. So qualitative, we're going to ask for people's opinions, what risk factors are significant, and the assets and risks can be placed in simple categories like low, medium, and high, those kinds of things. Another way over here is this traffic grid, where we have the risk factor, legacy Windows clients, the impact, and whether it's red, green, or orange, amber, caution. Each of those annual rate of occurrence, the cost of controls, and the overall risk. The cost of controls, how much is it going to cost us to mitigate the risk? And what we're going to have to determine there is the cost worth it? So security categorizations down there are in FIPS 199. They're low, medium, and high for those things. The 80-20 says we're going to fix the big things first. And we want to do that. The Marines have a thing called the 80% solution, where when you're 80% sure of something, you start doing it in those things. Mitigation, and mitigation is to reduce the risk. We can do that we identify the vulnerabilities and countermeasure controls, high value assets regardless of the likelihood of the threats, because the high value items, the ones that are critical to keeping the company running, have to be protected, period. The threats with high likelihood at a high annual rate of occurrence are going to be identified on these things, and procedures, equipment, or software that increase the likelihood of threats. In the countermeasures, we have to balance the cost. And what that means is we're not going to pay more to mitigate the risk. And mitigate, we don't eliminate risk, we reduce, we mitigate, we make it less likely. The cost or return on security investment, we take the new annual loss expectancy versus the old annual loss expectancy, and if the new one's is greater than the old one, then we shouldn't do that particular mitigation, because we don't want to pay more to mitigate the loss than we get back. And that's one of the things that we spend $10,000 to protect a $100 item. You really don't want to do that. A couple more kind of abbreviations, technical terms here. Recovery point objective is the amount of data loss that the system can sustain, measured in times. RPO, for instance, the RPO of 24 hours means that we can recover data up to 24 hours before the loss. That may or may not, I mean, that's just an example. You have to determine what your RPO is. If you have like orders, you probably want them up to really quickly, but otherwise you're going to be losing those orders and probably losing the customer when they don't get their item. So what we're doing here is determining how much data can be lost. The recovery time objective is how long can they remain offline, and that's basically what is the downtime of that. There may be other costs involved in this, such as reputation and what other people think about your being offline. So you have to consider those things also. If it's in days, then tape backup may be sufficient. If it's measured in minutes, then you're probably going to have to have some sort of a synchronization with another location. And when you store data someplace else, and for natural disasters, they're talking about if we have different, and we'll talk about in sites, but we have different sites or different setups, you want the backup to be farther away so that the natural disaster doesn't impact or affect both of them. Determine the critical, again, business functions are critical, and specify the appropriate risk countermeasures. And I think that's been said multiple times here. The options for risk are several, and risk mitigation is the overall process of reducing exposure to and the effects of the risk factors. We can have deterrence, reduce the likelihood of risk, and deterrence might be, guards or fences, things like that. We can have avoidance, where we just simply don't do the risk, stop doing the risky activity. Transference, where we assign it to a third party. Insurance would be something that we do there. Or we can accept the risk. What you don't want to do is ignore the risk. We're going to need to do continuous security monitoring and routine audits. We've talked about audits before, and log audits, logging, log reviews. All of those sorts of things still need to be done, because they can give you an indicator that something is about to happen that we may or may not want to be going on. I guess these things can be the deterrence, avoidance, and transference is kind of like driving an automobile. Deterrence, deterring you from speeding, may be the high-cost speeding ticket. Avoidance, stop doing the risky activity, don't text while you're driving. Transference, we have insurance of what goes on, and we do accept some risk because we're going to have deductibles on all of the insurance of some kind, unless you're really paying a pretty high premium. The mitigation options, this is a continuation. A lot of times security really isn't taken seriously until after something happens. It needs to be a priority, put a priority on security. That's not always an easy thing to do, because security really doesn't make any profit for the company. So sometimes we want to do that. Sometimes it makes people unhappy. The continuous security monitoring, performing routine audits, we talked about before. We need to do those things. The audits could be like in Active Directory, is who's done what, who's made what kind of changes. Logs, what kind of activities are the logs showing, and is any of it abnormal? Integration with third parties can be an issue. You have to have risk awareness and a security policy, as well as agreements, interoperability agreements. A memorandum of understanding is usually the first step. It's typically not going to be binding. We talked a little bit about service level agreements last night. Service level agreement is going to be a contract where somebody agrees to provide a service, and the level of service is going to be specified in the SLA. Business partners agreement is a way to set up partnerships in the system. So they say it's the most common model in IT is the partner agreement, where the large IT companies, Cisco, Microsoft, set up with resellers and solution providers. And then interconnection security agreements are defined by NIST, and any federal agency interconnecting its IT system to a third party, it has to have an ISA in order to have that to execute the agreement. Things that we have to determine is, can the parties live up to their agreements? Can the other party do what they say, and can we do what we say? We have to do those things. The data backups are one of the things. Who does the data backup? And if the other side does the data backup, can we have access? Do we have access to it? Privacy considerations and data ownership have to be an issue. Onboarding and offboarding business partners, it's usually easy to get somebody on, but then when they leave, it may or may not be a pleasant circumstance. So you may have people that are not as happy as you would want with the offboarding process. Mergers and acquisitions, when that happens, you're going to have some insecurities going on at that time, and you're also going to have perhaps some more attacks because you're going to have users that are maybe worried, upset, disgruntled, and they may try to attack the networks. And social media networks, what they say is you want your employees to be positive on social media about the company, but what you don't want them to do is to provide too much information. And these are the bullets again. Mergers and acquisitions, more attackers, anxious, angry, disgruntled employees, onboarding and offboarding. The privacy consideration, Europe does have some pretty strict laws about privacy, and some U.S. companies have gotten in trouble. What can happen with data, if it gets moved to one of the European countries, you may have different restrictions that you have to comply with, because you have to comply with the restrictions based on where the data is, and that's what we get with cloud storage. You don't always know where your information is physically, as it's going to be someplace on a physical machine, but we don't know always exactly where. I think there are companies that you can sign up with that tell you it's going to be on this particular, in this data center, or kept in the U.S. or whatever, but different laws in different countries moving to data in other countries, particularly the Europeans. There may be some issues involved. Service level agreements, and they have this picture of a document here. It's a service level agreement. What we do is, it's a legal protection for agreed upon service levels, downtimes, what data rates, what is the provider going to do for you, how much security are they going to provide, and then you have to determine if they're actually doing it and if they have the capability to do it. The service level agreements can be important for business continuity, and again, business continuity is something that when it happens, we need to have the plan so that we can put it in motion and get the business back up and running. If you don't have a plan and aren't able to implement it, most companies that have disasters and then come back go out of business within the first year, and many of them don't even make it back if they don't have these plans. The performance metrics are going to be things like availability, downtime, and response time. I put this chart here of availability so you can see what they say. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 nines. The downtime is going to be 32 minutes a year. The 5 nines, which is kind of a standard, is 5 minutes, that's 32 seconds, 5 minutes and 15 seconds a year. 99.99, 52.34. 99.9 is 8 hours and 45 minutes, 36 seconds a year. And then if we do 99% uptime, it's still 87 hours and 36 minutes downtime a year. The response time, some terms over here, mean time to failure and mean time between failure. Mean time to failure is generally going to be a non-repairable item, a hard drive, for instance. A mean time between failure is going to be for a repairable item like a server. And in the meantime to repair is how long it takes you to fix the item, the repairable. The mean time between a service incidents is the mean time, between failures and plus the mean time to repair. So to give you an idea of how long it's going to be before something may happen with those items. Change in configuration management, ITL, the IT infrastructure library has a configuration model where they label assets, a service asset, a configuration item. They'll go into a configuration management database, and we have to have, we're back to baselines, and the baseline for configuration and performance so that we know what's normal with these things. When you have change in configuration plan, the first step in these things is going to be a request for change when you start these things. A configuration management system is something that needs to be done. Change the configurations. Why does the configuration need to be changed? What needs to be changed? Those kinds of things. The configuration management moves, adds, and changes. They all should have job tickets and logs, and that's where we're going to get the authorization to do these things. And we need standard operating procedures to do them. Change management, we want to reduce the risk of service disruption so that it's requested and the change gets planned. And it may get planned because of proactive risk where we haven't waited for something to happen. So the change could be either a reactive or a proactive. The request for change is going to be the first step. If we have major changes, the company may have a change advisory board to determine what, how, when, where, scheduling and informing the stakeholders, scheduling the change, particularly those that can cause downtime. And then we have a rollback plan. We've talked about that before. When you make these changes, you need a rollback plan so that if it doesn't work, you can go back to where you were. You can at least get back to the system. That would be, to me, an advantage of virtual machines with snapshots, because we could take a snapshot before we started it. If it didn't work, we could always get back by applying the snapshot or bringing the snapshot back offline, bringing it back to the snapshot time. The review, understand the use of business continuity planning, business impact analysis, and risk assessment. Again, what we're basically doing is identifying what's critical, protecting it. At some point, we're probably going to want to practice the plans. That's the one in the next one. This is the disaster planning. Identify risk mitigation options and metrics. We're not going to eliminate risk. We're going to try to minimize risk. Describe risks involved in integrating data and systems with third parties, and anytime you get a third party involved, you're going to have a lot of agreement, and you're going to have to be really specific in those agreements about who does what and who gets access to what. Otherwise, you can have honest disagreements that somebody thought this had been done, but that wasn't what was really intended. Use configuration management and change management policies to reduce risk where we make plan changes. Maybe we get plotting, but we look at what the impact is going to be, try to assess the impact of the changes, good, bad, and then we're going to have the rollback plan just in case we assessed wrong. So let's do the questions here. What are the main components of a business impact analysis of a BIA.
Identify the critical functions, identify the assets, define the threats, and assess the risks.
All of that, exactly. What is a continuity of operations plan?
What happens if something happens?
Yeah,
How will the business still keep on running?
Yeah, it's a continuity of operations that is term usually mainly used by the government, same sort of policies and procedures as the business continuity planning testing systems, so that resources can be recovered, as you said, and restored after incidents. What metrics could be used to make quantitative calculations of risk due to a specific threat to a specific function? Quantitative. Nobody wants this one, huh? Take a look at the slide.
Basically, it's looking for your, basically your overall risk. Your cost of controls is basically like a flow chart of, what's going to happen.
And what it's going to cost. So we got the single loss, all the things we talk about, single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, and annual loss expectancy. How much is it going to cost? What factors determine the selection of security controls in terms of overall budget? How much are we going to pay for this stuff? How much do you pay to protect your house?
Oh, insurance and stuff.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be like a third party also?
It could be.
Not insurance, but I mean, excuse me, but like you contract something out, like, hey, I want this other security counsel to come in and, do my security. Is that still like a third person or no?
You can do that, but companies don't really typically like to have third parties in because of all the investigation that's required, the trust in the security area. This one we're going to see how much it's going to cost to mitigate the risk and compare that to the cost of not, and if it costs more to protect the item than we have assessed its value, we're not going to do that.
With ARO.
Yeah. ROSI. Yeah. ROSI, return on security investments, like a return on investment, ROI. The risk compared to the cost of the control. So, and one of the things that we did in the quantitative was try to quantify the risk in dollar terms. What metric would be put in place to minimize the acceptable downtime following an incident? What's the downtime? You guys don't look at the slides, do you?
Yes, but can't answer every question.
Go ahead, Dean.
Sorry, I was looking at the book, looking for it. I'm not looking at the slide.
Yeah, understood. It's the.
That would also be in your SLA, right? When you.
Yeah. Yes, it can be, exactly. The SLA is, and our corporate always negotiated those things, so we didn't really get involved in them. But they are very explicit in what's going to be done, where it's not something that you're going to write up in 20 or 30 minutes.
Right. I actually had to do one of those for United Airlines, and that sucked.
I'll bet it did. It took days, months to get it done.
Yes.
What type of risk mitigation option is offered by purchasing insurance?
that third party transference.
Transference?
Exactly, transference. What type of interoperability agreement would be appropriate at the outset of two companies agreeing to work with one another? I don't remember where that one is.
That's SLA.
Now the SLA is more specific. SLA is going to come along later. What's the first thing you're going to do?
Oh.
I thought it was on one of these slides.
The interoperability agreement.
Yeah, here we go.
Like the memorandum of understanding.
Yeah, the MOU.
Service level. Then you have your service level agreement. Yep. And you have your BPA.
Yep. Yep. So the MOU is going to be the first step, and it's generally going to be informal, and it's not going to be a legal sort of document. It's just a yes, we would like to work together kind of thing.
Yeah, that was 75 pages. Earlier.
What type of interoperability agreement is designed to ensure specific performance standards? Now we're getting to where you want to be.
Yes, the SLA.
That's the SLA. What metric is used to identify the expected service lifetime of non-repairables?
It's a high availability and uptime.
Well, what the letters?
Oh, shoot, hold on. Went too fast.
Yeah. The non-repairables. We have the repairables here, mean time between failure, and the repairables would then be
time.
The mean time to failure.
Mean time to failure.
These are just kind of things that I think they put a lot of these, just me, that put a lot in so they can ask test questions just to try to confuse me. What's the first step in initiating a change if an organization is following a formal change management process?
It's the configuration management, the ICT.
How about request for change?
Request for change, okay.
RFC. Okay, we got one more to do. Right. Disaster recovery. We just did business continuity planning, and that was about risk assessment, assessing the risk and trying to mitigate risk. Disaster recovery planning is kind of anticipating what can go wrong in developing contingency plans for it. So what we're doing in this one is playing what-if games. So the objectives, see, not very many. Develop effective disaster recovery plans. Use IT contingency planning to eliminate single points of failure and provide fault tolerance and redundancy. And when we do redundancy, we'll talk about RAID. Redundancy is not a backup. A backup needs to be put on a transportable media and taken someplace else, either that or replicated to some off-site location. So the planning that we do are going to describe the procedures to recover. Going to consider the impact of data and service loss in these things. For instance, and this is for instance, if the plumber loses his email account for a day, he may have some impact. He may lose some customers. He may not lose some customers. But if a bank loses its trading floor connection, it can lose millions of dollars an hour. And they used to talk about Amazon. Amazon hasn't been down for a while, but the Amazon site would go down occasionally a few years ago, and they would lose about $1 million an hour in downtime. What we want to do is avoid the loss of our mission critical systems, and we identified them a little earlier. That's what we did in the other one. We have to identify the scenarios in both natural and man-made. And what's the risk and the cost of assessment. The recovery cost plus the versus the downtime cost is really what we're looking at. We've had similar concepts before. And then do threat modeling, BIA, for each of the scenarios that we identify. Identify tasks and the resources and responsibilities for them. We have to specify who does what. So in a who does what, what's the most critical functions? And the most critical functions are the ones that we're going to bring back online first. If we have this thing, what are the available resources? The available resources, should they be purchased, held as stock, or will the disaster affect the availability of supplies? Will we be able to get it? If we need a building, do we own it or lease it? Kind of things. And then the time scales, what are the time scales for resumption of services? We also need to train the staff in recovery, disaster recovery, and change management. We really need to practice these things. And I'll get ahead of myself, but we need to practice these things, because if you don't, then people kind of clueless when things happen. For all you Navy veterans, I know that if you're on ships, you were probably part of a fire party, and you do a fire drill every night so that you can practice how to fight the fire. Because if you're on a ship and you have a fire, there's not a whole lot of places to go if you're at sea. We need to train the staff, practice what's going on. Succession planning is what's going to happen if leadership becomes immobilized. What they're really talking about, the CEO dies, what happens? Who's going to take over? Who's going to take over which of these things? So succession planning needs to be taken care of. Disaster recovery tabletop exercises, basically walkthroughs where we're going to test the plan once we have written the plan, and they say the staff ghost the same procedures as they would in a disaster without actually creating disaster conditions. What we want to do is simulate, do exercise, simulate what goes on. Eventually, you really do want to practice the plan itself. That's going to take probably some of the business out of commission for some time, and businesses don't want to do that. So we need to, and you can do simulations, and again, simulations in virtual machines, a lab environment might be a good way to do it. The problem with a lab environment, you can't be absolutely sure that you've mimicked your actual network. After we do the simulations, we're going to review and update the plans. What worked, what didn't work. We're going to do the same thing after an incident. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do to not allow it to happen again? We also, when new threats emerge and systems change, we need to review to be sure that the plan still takes care of what we need. And then notifications, when something happens, we're going to notify the stakeholders. There may be legal requirements, and if customer information has been compromised, we're going to have to notify them also. Secure recovery, what happens a lot of times in these things, when we're trying to recover, we need to get the system back online. Let's get it back online. Let's get it up and running, get it up and running. You need to do that in a secure manner. We still have to take into account the CIA for the company, what's going on, how are we going to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and of course availability is what we're trying to get back to generally. After a disaster, it may lie too much on availability at the expense of the other two. Security of the backup data sets stored as spares or at alternate sites, we need to be sure that the backups do remain secure. Security of systems following the recovery operation. So we need to not only overcome whatever the disaster is, but we need to do it securely, because without that security, then we've created more risk. Contingency plannings, what we have to do is think of all the items that could fail. And when you start thinking about a network of all the items could fail, there's a whole lot of them. Like anything could fail, obviously. And how many of them could fail at once? What happens if this and that fails? What are our single points of failure? Is there a critical loss or an unacceptable loss? And the two, critical is critical for the ongoing of the business. Unacceptable is we don't want that. So we're going to minimize or eliminate single points of failures and have fault tolerance. Fault tolerance, RAID, redundant array of independent or inexpensive, and the eyes changes back and forth disks. What we do there is run disks in an array so that if one of them fails, we can continue running until we can put a new disk in that array and maintain the data. We need fault tolerant systems and procedures that can provide the same or nearly so level of service despite what's going on, and that's always going to be the objective. If an incident's going on, that we can maintain our level of service. UPSs and standby power. A UPS is not designed for long-term power generation or power supply. UPS typically going to last for a few minutes. They're designed to give you enough power to keep the systems running until the standby power, standby generator maybe, comes online and takes the load. Or if we don't have a standby generator, keeps it online long enough to do an orderly shutdown so we're not crashing servers. Generally, they're going to come back online, but sometimes you crash a server and it just doesn't start up again. So you need to do orderly shutdowns of these things. We need backups, and the backups need to be stored at off-site locations. Clusters. A cluster gives us some redundancy. We could have a load sharing cluster, which we talked about last night. We can also have a data cluster. A data cluster has multiple machines. If one of them goes down, the other ones pick up the load and take care of keeping the system going. Redundant components, we may have load balancing network links. We really want to avoid, if possible, a single connection, although I think that's what most of us actually do. But we can do adapter teaming, where we use two NICs going in the same direction, going to the same location. It's probably going to give us more bandwidth, because when we do NIC teaming, adapter teaming, NIC teaming, we double the capacity of whatever the capacity of the NICs are, and they have to be the same. They have to be balanced. If we have 100 and 100, it works. If we have a gig, 1,000 and 100, then it's going to have to use the lower level, which would be 100. We need to design, if possible, the network with multiple paths. And then the power supply, UPSs for battery backup, and then backup generators. We also need to look at backup power supplies in the servers, or second power supplies. A number of them come with two power supplies. If one of them goes down, we can use the second one. Cooling fans, mechanical in nature, probably one of the higher failure items, and we need those things because we have cooling on all of the objects that are going to run hot, and we need to do that. We need to be able to replace the cooling fans. Mechanical, probably going to fail perhaps quicker than other items. Hardware and spare parts, the obvious thing is to have readily available. If a server goes down, we stick a new server in, and that may not be practical from a budget standpoint. Spare parts, how quickly do you need them? Do you need to keep them in stock? Which ones do you need? And that's where the mean time to failure and the mean time between failure estimations can help you. Which spares do you need in order to keep the network running? If you can afford whole systems, that obviously is going to be the better way to do it, but it can become very expensive. RAID, redundant array of independent disks, allows us to have fault tolerance except for RAID 0. RAID 0 doesn't have any fault tolerance. It has striping, they say with parity. Actually, it doesn't have parity because parity would allow us to get things back. RAID 5 has striping with parity. RAID 0 has striping, which is going to increase, and they say they don't have a parity stripe over here, the data rate of the disks. When we do this, we can write simultaneously to each disk, and we write parts of the file to each disk. It has no fault tolerance, which means that if one of these disks fails, we can replace it and then restore it from backup. It increases the speed of data, or speed, the disk drive speed, because we have the simultaneous reads and writes of the data. RAID 1 is mirroring or duplexing depending on how many controllers that we have. If we have 2 disks and 1 disk controller, then it's called mirroring. If we have 2 disks and 2 disk controllers, it's called duplexing. The duplexing obviously going to give us a little bit better redundancy because we don't have the single point of failure with the controller. We do simultaneous writes. What we really have is a copy and a backup copy of it, a mirror copy of it, so that both of them have the same data all the time. The reads on this one can be quicker, the writes can be slower because it has to write the data twice. In this one, if one of them fails, then we can continue operating with the second disk. We don't have any data redundancy after that until we put a second disk in the system and create the mirror again. When we take it out, we have to break the mirror in order to do that. RAID 5 is striping with parity, and what the parity bit does is it allows you to recreate the data. It's not a copy of the data, but it allows recreation of the data. This says striping with distributed parity, which means that on the first disk, the parity for it's going to maybe be on the second disk, the second one's on the third, and the third one's on the data 1. There are a number of different ways to store the parity stripes, but in RAID 5, that's pretty typical of it. If one disk goes down, we can continue running until we can replace it and rebuild the RAID 5, the RAID array. The parity stripes that are stored elsewhere are going to let us recreate the data. If you have a failure in RAID 5, it's probably going to be slower. RAID 0.1 and RAID 1.0 are really handy because what we have is the speed of striping and the redundancy of mirroring. And the difference between a 0.1 and a 1.0 is a RAID 0.1 first does the striping and then creates the mirror. RAID 1.0 creates the mirror first and then does the striping. It's just the order that the process is done in. RAID 5.0 is a sets a striping with RAID 5 striping with parity, and then we're going to mirror it. So it's going to have a couple of layers of redundancy, the RAID 5 redundancy as well as the mirror redundancy or duplexing redundancy, depending on how many controllers that you have. Clusters can provide fault tolerance because what we have with them is multiple front ends, 2 front ends that manage the data. And in the load sharing cluster, we had multiples that went to the websites. We can configure the nodes for failover. This one is an active-active, which means both of them are operating, both of them are taking data. We're going to have out here somewhere, we're going to have a cluster controller that's going to have a virtual IP address. It's going to get the information and then send it to one cluster member or another. This one down here is active-passive. One of them is actually doing the work, and the other one just sitting here waiting for something bad to happen so it can start doing the work. If this one goes down, this one takes up the load. Up here in the active-active, if one of them goes down, the other one takes up the load. It may not be as fast as it was before, but it's still running, so we can have active-active or active-passive in these things. Spares and site redundancy. Again, spares and sites provide redundancy for damage to resources stored at the primary site. Sites redundancy against failures of utility supplies, natural disasters. Site redundancy can be very expensive depending on which ones we have, and we're going to have a slide here in a minute. We'll talk about cold, warm, and hot sites. How much do you have? And spares are categorized as hot, warm, or cold. If we had a server, a hot server would be one that was up to date, the operating system was up to date, and the data had been synchronized to it. A warm one would have the operating system installed, perhaps, and a cold one might be that we're ready to order a new server. Replication, if we need to keep the data up to the minute, up to date. How much downtime, how far back do we want to go? We have synchronous and asynchronous data. In synchronous data, it's got to be written to both sites before it's considered as being completed. This can be an expensive proposition. The asynchronous, we write it to one site, the primary site, and then it synchronizes the data to the other or the secondary site. Optimum distance between sites, you need to have enough distance so that a natural disaster doesn't affect both sites. I'm looking for it's got, I think it had in here, I thought it was like 150 kilometers, 500 kilometers. They say that if sites are too close within 500 kilometers, both of them could be affected by the same disaster. So you need to separate the sites. I think the last thing, no, let's get that. We can have, and in sites, we can have hot sites, cold sites, and warm sites. In hot sites, we completely outfit a new location with equipment. It's going to be up and running, up to date. All the updates have been installed, and we can quickly go from one to the other. If the primary site goes down, we can start running immediately at the hot site. A warm site has some equipment. It may not be up to date, may not have the data, it will take some time to get it online. A cold site could be something as incomplete as an empty building. And when you start talking about these sites, one of the things to consider is whether you're going to own it or lease it. If you own it, you can always get there. If you lease it, if it's a major disaster, if you do lease and you don't have a lease in place, you may not be able to get anything. And that did happen after 9/11, that there just wasn't any place to put offices. Some of them obviously had hot sites because they were up the next day. Some of them didn't have any kind of a disaster recovery plan in place at all. So the review is develop effective disaster recovery plans, use IT contingency planning to eliminate single points of failure and provide fault tolerance and redundancy. So let us do the questions. What's the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity planning?
Disaster recovery is basically, okay, what happens when a disaster happens and how to recover from a disaster, so the whole implementation for that. And your business continuity planning is basically how do we fix it before it ever happens?
Yeah, risk assessment, exactly. Why are disaster recovery exercises an important part of creating a disaster recovery plan?
It builds that risk mitigation, so in case something does happen, you're ready for it and the collateral damage is not so high.
Yeah. Review and update. And I think that you may have heard the term, you fight the way you practice. It's the same way here.
Yep.
If you don't practice these things, it's just going to be a disaster in itself when you try to implement it. People don't know what they do, where they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to bring with them. They do have to be, they do need to be practiced. In which types of disaster recovery sites would you expect to have to install computer equipment?
Like mainframe areas.
Well, this is the hot site, warm site, cold site. Which one?
Or warm site.
Well, the warm site's probably going to have the equipment.
Your cold site.
Cold site may be nothing. It may even just be a thought. Is RAID mirroring a backup technology?
Theoretically.
No, it's not, and
yeah,
it's a redundancy, data redundancy. Backup technology is when we back it up to a media that we take someplace else. The RAID's going to be right there in the server room, so that if a disaster happens, if the wet pipe sprinkler system ruptures and floods the server room, the RAID's going to go down with everything else, and it does not make a permanent copy that you can take someplace else and get it back and then restore it.
But couldn't you like have the RAID set up in there, then have like, for instance, the cloud or something like that set up? Would that be part of a RAID also, or no?
That would be no. The RAID itself is the data redundancy in an individual set. That would be that would be a redundancy, but it would be a redundant site sort of arrangement. And that's the way, to me, and it's just me, that's the way that it seems to be a good way to do backups. Microsoft servers have a thing called distributed file system where you can set up the disks and have them in different locations and have them replicate across the internet or your private network. And when you write to one, it replicates to the other one so that you always have the same data on each disk set.
Oh, wow.
It's not used in a lot of cases, but it seems to me that that would be a way to keep things consistent. And if it goes down, it's an Active Directory thing. It uses an Active Directory call. If one of them goes down, it goes and uses the other one. I mean, it could be a transparent way to maintain your data.
Right.
True or false? UPS can provide emergency power for days at a time.
It's negative.
No, we have to have a standby generator for that.
Yeah.
What factor is most likely to reduce a system's fault tolerance? I don't like the way they ask some of these questions, but that's just me.
What factor?
Yeah. What would be non-fault tolerant? There we go.
Like any kind of incident?
What about
Oh,
single
points? Yeah.
Yeah, single point of failure, yeah. What phrase describes ensuring that critical functions remain properly staffed? Actually, I would say critical positions. How are you sure that you always have a CEO?
Oh, that's your, yeah.
Yes,
that's your
succession
of command.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Except in the civilian world, they call it succession planning.
Oh.
Well, in the military, it's pretty straightforward. Not so much so in the civilian world. What is a tabletop exercise? I'll do this one because that's I kind of messed it up. I said simulate. It's not simulations. It's a non-simulated drill of emergency response procedures where you discuss their responses, but actual emergency conditions are not simulated. What security considerations affect an alternate hot site that do not generally apply to warm or cold sites? What are you going to have at a hot site if you're just going to go drive there and start working?
You're going to have a clean room. You're going to have the security. You're going to have all of that.
All that. Everything's going to be up to date, current data, current updates, all the security in place. That's why it becomes so expensive, not just the equipment, but it has to actually be a site that you can go to the next day and work at it as if nothing had happened. What's the risk? What risk is there in leasing alternate sites? Or actually, I would say in planning to lease alternate sites.
Just having that extra red tape you have to go through and leasing a site and getting it set up and having issues like 9/11 and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, the issue would be what if there are no locations available anymore?
Right.
I mean, that's the risk. If you own the building or if you own whatever you're going to, you own it. You can you can use it. But typically they don't lease a location until they need it. And then if you need it, it may not be available. And that did happen after 9/11. It was such and Katrina. There were such big disasters that there was nothing to lease. And some of the places in New York went way out of the city in order to find some place to set their businesses back up.